One of the most familiar stories in the whole history of the Western world is also one of the most ancient. The story of Adam and Eve in chapter 3 of Genesis. But to understand that very familiar story, I think it's important to put it in context of the first two chapters of Genesis. You remember that the very first thing we hear about human beings in Genesis 1 is that God has made us in God's image and likeness, and that God looked at us and saw that we were good. Now, it's within that context that one has to hear the temptation given by the serpent in chapter 3. Eat this and be like God. Eat the fruit of this tree which you've been forbidden to eat, and then you will become like God. What precisely is the temptation? Well, it's not a temptation about disobedience, because I think, among other things, that trivializes the whole story. It's really a temptation not to believe chapter 1. Because the first thing that we've heard about ourselves in chapter 1, the very first thing we hear about being human beings is that God made us in God's image and likeness. And here is the serpent saying, in effect, no, you're not like God. You've got to do something to become like God. Right now, what you are is a mess. You're junk. We're going to have to make you valuable. And in order to be made valuable, you're going to have to act. You're going to have to break yourself up by your bootstraps to be like God. Don't believe what you've heard in chapter 1, that God has made you like God. You're trash. The first temptation, in other words, is not to believe in the goodness of being a human being. The first temptation is despair. That's immensely important. And I think it is one of the most profound, one of the wisest insights of the whole of the Hebrew and Christian traditions, to recognize that evil enters the world through despair, through an inability to accept the goodness, the rightness, the blessedness of one's own being as a creature, the inability to accept the goodness of being finite, the refusal to recognize that we are like God. That story of the emergence of evil in the world in chapter 3 of Genesis was designed to answer a very big problem. Where does evil come from? Because you recognize that people who are polytheists in the ancient world, people who believed in many gods, had no problem with evil. The good gods make the good things, and the bad gods make the bad things. It was a perfectly easy, perfectly straightforward answer to the problem of evil. Evil really becomes a difficulty, however, if, like Israel, you believe there is only one God, that God is all-powerful, responsible for all that exists, and that God is also good. If that's true, where does evil come from? How does evil enter the universe if God, who creates everything, is good? The problem, I think, has been summed up in a catchy little jingle by the American poet Archibald MacLeish in his excellent play, J.B., his retelling of the story of the book of Job. The little jingle, which runs throughout the play, is, if God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. That is to say, if God is God, really the author of everything, then God must be the author of evil and can't be good. If, on the other hand, God is really good, then God can't be the author of evil, and therefore God doesn't make everything and isn't really God. That was the dilemma that faced ancient Israel. And the answer of ancient Israel to the question is that evil doesn't come from God, it comes from us. And it comes from us because we reject ourselves. We refuse to accept the goodness of our own being. Evil, therefore, is despair. There's an old and familiar statement among opera lovers that whenever the devil appears as a character in an opera, the devil gets all the best tunes. Well, one could say much the same thing about Milton's poem Paradise Lost. All of the best lines, all of the most exciting lines are given to Satan. It's because Milton envisions Satan as a monster of pride, as if the source of all evil is pride or vanity or self-assertion. Much more profound, I think, is the vision of Dante in the Divine Comedy. When Virgil leads Dante into the Inferno, into hell, in the first part of the Divine Comedy, carved over the door is the inscription, "Leave hope, all you who enter here." Precisely right. The entryway to hell is hopelessness, despair. And when, in the lowest pit of hell, finally Dante and Virgil come face to face with Satan himself in the poem, Satan is not a kind of tragic hero, as in Milton, shaking his fist at the heavens and declaring that it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. No, Satan is locked in ice, ice made from his own tears, which are frozen by the beating of his wings, endlessly seeking to free himself. Satan is locked in ice, weeping. At the heart of hell is cold and icy despair. Dante, I think, got the image of evil right in a way that Milton did not. To cite one more great poet, the German poet Goethe, in Part 1 of Faust, the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil in order to achieve his own desires, has a moment when the devil, Mephistopheles, is called upon to explain who he is. Faust demands a clear answer, "Who are you?" of the demon. And the demon responds with what I must confess I think are perhaps the wisest lines, and therefore the most chilling lines ever written about evil. The demon says, "I am the spirit who says no. All things that are come to an end. Better there should never have been anything." Do you recall St. Paul? In Christ there is not yes and no, there is only yes. Well, in the demon, in Mephistopheles, in Goethe's great play, there is no yes and no, there is only no. No to what? No to everything. Is there any reason for hope? No. Any value to existence? No. Any point in going on to tomorrow? No. Is there anything to be expected that would be valuable or good or pleasant from you? No. Me? No. From Mephistopheles? No. Well, is there any reason, therefore, to exist at all? No. As a matter of fact, everything that exists comes to an end, is literally finite, and therefore it's all trash. Better there should never have been anything. The great insight of Goethe is that evil says no to being. That God begins, "Let there be light," and the response of evil is, "No, let there be darkness. There isn't any value to being at all. If you're not God, you're junk. If you're not everything, you're nothing. If you are not infinite, if you're merely finite, then better you should never have been at all." You see, what Goethe and Dante realized was that Satan is not a monster of pride. Satan is a monster of despair. Satan is not one who thinks that he is everything. Satan is the one who's convinced he's nothing and shouldn't exist at all. Satan is not one who hates God. Satan is the one who refuses to believe that God could possibly love him. That vision of evil, that it arises in despair, in the rejection of the goodness of finite being, it is that irrational insistence on our own worthlessness, that conviction that we ought not to be, which is, I think, in accord with the Jewish and Christian traditions, the heart of darkness, the real origin of evil. Now, you may very well be saying to yourself, that's very exaggerated. How often does one find oneself genuinely willing one's own non-existence? How often does one really despair of the goodness of one's own being? And the answer is probably a great deal more than any one of us would like to admit. Oh, I don't mean that we do it explicitly very often. But are there not moments when you have been so disappointed with yourself, that you have been so discouraged by your own failure, so embarrassed by your own weakness, that if for one instant you had the power to blot the whole thing out rather than confront that weakness or failure, that you would have done it? And if you have met those moments, then I suggest to you, you know how accurate that description of evil by Goethe is. The spirit that says no, better there should never have been anything. That, of course, is exactly what chapter 3 of Genesis is describing to us. A moment when we fall prey to the temptation that we are not made like God, that we cannot accept the goodness of being finite, the goodness of being human beings. And in many ways, I suppose, one could say that the whole subsequent course of salvation history, up until the coming of Jesus, is the story of God's constant repetition of his judgment on the human race. God looked at us and saw that we were good, and our repeated refusal to accept that judgment, our refusal to accept that it is good to be human beings. And so we find ourselves continually more separated from one another. If the result of the sin of Adam and Eve is separation from God, then in the next generation in Genesis, the result of the sin of Cain in murdering his brother Abel is that human beings can't turn their backs on one another any longer. Human beings are separated from one another. And then the result of the sin of the Tower of Babel is that we live in mutually alienated, separated communities. We live in communities that can't speak to one another anymore. As sin grows in the world, we constantly become more alone, more alienated, more separated from God and from one another, living in separated communities. A mad dash to become God ends up depriving us of our ability to really be human. And it's within that context that Christianity proclaims the good news of salvation. And what is that good news? Well, St. Paul speaks of the mystery hidden from all generations, but now revealed in our time. And that mystery turns out to be what I might almost describe as God's secret ambition. God thinks that being human is so good, so wonderful, that God has chosen to become one. That while we were in a mad dash to stop being human and become God, God has chosen to become what we are. The one who was equal to God did not think being in the form of God was anything to be held on to, but emptied himself of that, becoming like all other human beings. So says the hymn in Philippians chapter 2. The great good news is that God has taken on humanity along with us. Salvation is the story of God's entry into the world in order to reaffirm the first judgment. That first judgment being that God has looked at us and saw that we were good. This time, we have to come to believe that judgment. We are saved when we come to agree with God that being human is good. Salvation is not the story of God's rescuing us from an evil universe. Salvation is the story of God's coming to live in the universe with us so that we finally recognize how good the universe is. Now, of course, that's no easy move to come to recognize the goodness of the universe, because in the course of human history, we've done a great deal to deface that goodness. When absolute love really does enter our world in human form, when absolute love comes to us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, we'll kill him. That's the great double vision of the cross. The first part of the cross's message to us, the first thing the cross reveals, is how deep the evil of the world is, that its only response to perfect love is to try and kill it. But the second half of the message of the cross is that absolute love will even embrace death because of its acceptance of the goodness of creation. Father, forgive them. They don't really know what they're doing. It's when that is said that Jesus can say, "It is finished." What's finished? What's finished is Jesus. Everything that can be given has been given. There's nothing left to give away. Jesus is like a sponge that has been wrung out. Every drop has now been drained. He is finished. And because everything that he is has been given away, he can't stay dead. The tomb can't hold him. That's the great proclamation of salvation. It does not make light of the evil of the world. It recognizes the depth and reality of that evil, and then, in embracing it, overcomes it. It insists that life is bigger than death, that love is greater than hatred, that goodness is far deeper than evil. It insists that evil is the distortion, the parasitic growth on the goodness of creation. It insists that evil is that which should not be, and it embraces creation, and therefore shows us once again the goodness of all of creation, including that part of creation which is humanity. How do we embrace and accept that salvation? In two ways, intimately related to one another. First, we have to be willing to affirm the goodness of who we are. I've often liked to say over the years that the great Christian proclamation has two clauses, and one has to be able to say both clauses with equal strength. And the statement is, I'm not God, and that's a good thing. To recognize that one is finite, that one is not God, that one is dependent, and to recognize that as a good, to be able to celebrate finiteness, to be able to embrace one's own creatureliness. The second part of that is that I have to be able to embrace your creatureliness. That it's not enough for me to accept the deep goodness of my being. I have to accept the deep goodness of your being. That our salvation is always salvation within a community. That it is by mutual love, mutual respect, the celebration of one another's goodness as human beings, that salvation is truly accepted. I have to be able to come to agreement with God's judgment not only on me, but on you. God has looked at us and seen that we were good. It is within a community that we can begin to undo that alienation which is the result of evil. The fruit of sin is separation from God and from one another. Therefore, salvation brings us together with one another and so back into union with God. That's why we cannot have a celebration of salvation apart from a celebration of community. If we're going to accept the news of salvation, if we're going to accept the gospel, we have to do it by entering into community. There is no salvation without entry into community. There is no salvation without church.